Today, we become legends.
Hey, my name's Inter, welcome back to the channel. Item building in Smite can be complicated. In fact, it's one of the hardest parts of the game to fully understand to a level where you can just naturally create builds on the fly. On the way to that understanding though, I have 15 items, 3 for every conquest role / class of gods that you definitely should be building right now. So first up for the carry role we have Bloodforge. Since the nerf to Devourer's Gauntlet late last season, Assy had been the go-to lifesteal rush for hunters in the ADC role. However, since Assy took a few nerfs and Bloodforge received a few buffs since the start of the season, Bloodforge actually outclasses even Assy, which itself outclasses Devos as a rush for hunters. While the lifesteal on Bloodforge definitely doesn't compete with the likes of Assy or Devos, the gap has been narrowed a little since those two items are more lifesteal focused than Bloodforge and thus were hit harder in 10.3. Bloodforge has other more useful stats that weren't lifesteal that didn't get hit because of that in the update. Bloodforge also has more power and comes online faster than Devos, which requires stacking. It comes with some attack speed since the 10.3 patch and isn't even super expensive anymore. This is basically the go-to rush on hunters right now and definitely should be in your builds. Next up we have Kin Size, a classic for the ADC role that's never really been bad necessarily, but is being severely underutilized since its recent buff to 6% max health damage on hit. Anyone complaining about tanks being too strong in Season 10 but building crit instead of this monster of an item is doing it wrong. It's the DPS king for shredding tanks and gives you a more flexible build option as opposed to locking into 3 crit items, which with a starter leaves only 2 slots open in your build for other stats. That said, Kins is even good to slot into a crit build at the moment due to still being able to get to high attack speed, capped when using a half decent steroid, even using crit builds. Speaking of crit builds though, our final ADC item for the video is Bladed Boomerang, which due to some buffs to the item and nerfs to its competitor item, Rage, has become the go-to third crit item in your build alongside the ever-present Demon Blade and Deathbringer. This item is now noticeably cheaper than Rage and when fully stacked up on the passive gives slightly more crit overall along with that 20% attack speed, which is very useful to have on a crit item, since it can be harder to find attack speed in crit builds as opposed to Kin's builds. And while it can be a little inconsistent in keeping it stacked up, the base stats are solid now and it comes online faster than Rage since the item is at full power the minute you buy it instead of needing to stack it like with Rage. Boomerang has pretty much displaced Rage out of the meta crit builds and you should definitely be building this right now if you're going crit. Moving on to some mid/mage items though, first up we have Doomorb, which since the nerfs to Book of Thoth and Tablet of Destinies, has somewhat become the go-to for a high power early game rush item. It is expensive, but it doesn't need to stack like Book of Thoth, so in reality it actually comes online faster than Book, and of course has that massive 145 base power with up to 20 extra on the passive. Some percent pen is nice to have once you get a bit later into the game as well, and the movement speed on this item can help you juke and maneuver around fights a bit easier. Gods like Hebo and Morrigan specifically love this item for that reason, but it's viable on most mid-mages at the moment. Another option you have as a rush in mid right now though is Spear of Desolation. This thing is much better if you want early pressure due to its flat pen instead of percent pen and much cheaper price tag. Since the cost reduction, this item is just so efficient and probably the best quick power spike item you can rush into for early mid pressure. The 110 power and 15 pen alone for that price is solid, but this also has that extra bit of CDR too, which is always welcome. Of course, this item doesn't have to be your rush, you can absolutely grab its second item or even third after a Doomorb or Book of Thoth rush as well. If you don't need Divine Ruin, this should be your go-to pen option in the early game as a mage. And finally we have Soul Gem. This item was already low-key pretty solid before its passive got made 25% better in a patch a little while back. Stacking only 3 times now instead of 4, this item is what you should be looking at for sustain in your builds. Unless you're a specific handful of mages like Anubis or Hades, throw that Bancross Talon out the window and grab a Soul Gem, you won't regret it. Similar to Tablet of Destinies in a way, this is best used on mages that can perform a cannon barrage of abilities like Merlin, Tiamat or Agni, as well as gods that can stack the effect without needing to hit enemies, such as Janus who can stack it from his threshold and portals on himself, or Hebo whose cap it gives a free stack every time plus his one's absurdly low cooldown. Soul Gem is in a great spot right now, and if you're one of those mage players that likes a cheeky bit of sustain in your build, this is for you. Moving on to some support items, first up we have Prophetic Cloak, which is sort of a no-brainer for supports right now. Once stacked, it is literally the best item in the game and it's not even close. 70 of both protections in itself is unheard of, but this thing also has some health, 10% CDR, which is really nice because it's hard to come by in support builds in comparison to solo builds, plus it gives 30 of each procs to your backliners, mitigating the damage they take by roughly 10% at level 20, more at lower levels. And speaking of mitigations, the passive on this also provides 17.5% personal mitigations, which can't be beaten by enemy penetration. This item is stupid good and not even that hard to stack for most supports. There are a few that struggle with stacking it, ones with bad ranged poke like Ymir or Cabrakan, but most of the supports you'll encounter can stack this pretty easily, and when stacked, it's just insane. So, despite being dethroned as the most bloated item in the game by the aforementioned Prophetic Cloak, Gauntlet of Thebes is still an insanely efficient item that should be in most, if not all, of your support builds. It stacks super quickly, much faster than Cloak, and comes with 65 of each prots and 250 health when stacked. Almost matching Cloak when you don't factor in the mitigations, since the extra 100 health makes up for the loss of 5 protections, definitely. This is also easier to slot into a build, since literally any support can buy this and be pretty happy, whereas Cloak, as I mentioned, some supports have trouble stacking it and will either have to wait longer to get the full benefit or not buy it at all. Thebes is just a plug and play, efficient support item that gives you amazing bang per buck. So this next one is a bit more of a wild card, but that's Chronos Pendant. No, you didn't skip back to the mid lane section accidentally. Chronos Pendant is really good on a lot, dare I say most supports right now, and it's not just your Moja. Yes, it's crazy good on her because of Omi, but Guardians are very ability reliant to peel for teammates or engage a fight. Without their abilities, they're a body blocking target dummy at best and a bumbling idiot at worst. And with the longest overall cooldowns on average of any class, CDR is extra valuable to Guardians due to its percent nature. The problem is, CDR is hard to come by on most support items outside of the Cloak tree. Solo lane warriors get 10% CDR for free and can go more selfish items like Genji's Guard, Breastplate of Valor and Regrowth, etc. But supports often can't get away with that, and due to how insanely efficient the previous two mentioned items are, you can very easily reach the protections cap in 5 items, leaving one slot open for a damage or utility option, of which Pendant provides both. I highly recommend getting one damage item in your support builds to have more of an impact, especially in random ranked and casuals. And while Reaver or other options are still decent, I think Pendant wins out for the sheer utility it provides with that 20% base CDR and extra on the passive. So moving on to some solo/warrior items, first up we have Gladiator Shield. Since becoming available to all classes, this item has become a staple in almost every solo lane build to squeeze some extra damage out of all those protections you'll be stacking. Given how solo laners are designed to be in the thick of the fight for as long as possible, getting off as many rotations of their kit as they can, this item ends up adding huge amounts of damage in your average teamfight, and despite the nerf, it's still an almost must build on most solo laners. It's of course especially good on gods with low cooldown spam abilities or more than 4 abilities like Arthur or Artio, but even in just a regular solo lane build, this thing is still great right now. Magical defense options for solo laners are pretty limited right now, with not too many good options, and that leaves Amulet of the Stronghold as a good go-to for most solos. The Glyph passive can provide upwards of 40 magical procs on its own with a build that stacks physical defense from other items. With the imbalance of magical and physical defense items at the moment, where physical defense items are generally much stronger, it only makes sense that an item like this would be good. With capped physical procs, this item provides over 100 magical procs, which on its own is enough, especially when combined with a mixed defense item like Stone of Binding somewhere else in your build. Since magical defense is less needed in most games, given most structures and objectives do physical damage, and most teams have only one major magical threat in the mid laner, this amount of magical defense is often enough on its own and allows you to itemize heavily into the more useful and more efficient physical defense items, and just slap this glyph in 4th or 5th slot and call it a day. Do note that if the enemy team has more than one major magical damage dealer, such as a magical ADC, Alquang jungle, and a mid laner, this build path isn't preferred as it really won't be enough to stop all that incoming damage, and I would recommend getting at least 2 magical defense items in that case, but in most games that have only the mid as their main magical damage, this item is great for solos and frees up slots in the build for other useful things. Like Stone of Binding, which despite the nerfs is still one of, if not the best way for tanks to threaten squishies in year 10. At level 20, this thing comes with 20 flat protection reduction, which against a level 20 backliner is removing around a third of their protections and increasing the damage they take by around 10%. This not only works for your damage as you're diving, but can combine with flat penetration from your own damage dealers to allow close to true damage on those squishies. Support protection auras notwithstanding, of course. All this while having really efficient stats that's perfectly balanced, so it's good in literally every game. This item is also super good on supports, but I thought I'd include it in the solo section as it's a better fit for the solo playstyle. Moving into some must-have jungle items though, first up we have Jotun's Wrath, which since the removal of flat pen from the Crusher, has become basically the only option for early game flat pen for ability based junglers if you don't need Brawler's Beat Stick's anti-heal effect. Jotun's is a classic and has all the stats you need for an ability jungler in the early game, and has a really good glyph that gives some more CDR on top of that base 20%. Keeping it relevant into the late game as well. Just a solid item that really should be your first item on every ability based jungler out there unless you need Brawler's anti-heal. Moving from flat pen to percent pen though, Heartseeker is just a busted item and has been for a long time. It's the one-stop shop for tank deletion for ability based junglers and hunters for that matter. High power, percent pen, and a passive that deals max health damage on ability hits. This item, along with how readily available percent pen has become on physical ability items, allows junglers to be a real threat even to tanks in the late game. On a full kit rotation, this item's passive alone does 19.5% max health damage against a tank when accounting for the reduction from subsequent hits. That's an insane number that comes out at around 700 for most tank builds just from one kit rotation. Pre-mitigations of course, but still, that's crazy for just an item passive. Heartseeker should be in all your ability based jungler builds, no question. And finally, we have another on-hit item effect, but this one targets squishies a bit more than Heartseeker does, and that's of course the Crusher. It was strong before the rework and it's arguably even stronger after, having really good base stats with that attack speed being stronger than you think for auto attack cancelling and bits of extra damage when your abilities are on cooldown. But speaking of bits of extra damage, similar to Heartseeker, this item also adds that little bit of extra oomph to your abilities that can really make the difference in bursting people down. Crusher is still super good even after the nerfs. But that's 3 items for each role that you should be building in Smite right now. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to drop a like before you leave, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.